sounds a little cliche, but I think that leaders have to remember that the they work for their teams, right? Their teams don't work for them. It's a very important concept. It's been, servant leadership should be baked into everything in healthcare because we all serve our patients. And in order to serve our patients, our providers need to be supported. And so that was always my ethos and what I shared to my staff. But again, easy to say, difficult to implement.
Welcome to Safe Space Made Simple, a practical podcast that guides clinical leaders and healthcare managers to create trust and support with their teams. I'm your host, Trace Hobson. Join me for weekly interviews, practical tools, and inspiring transformational stories of bringing people together in healthcare. Now, let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Safe Space Made Simple, the podcast that's committed to helping you as a clinical leader, a healthcare manager, or an executive to create a safe space for yourself and for your team. Today's episode is a very special one. I've invited 3 panelists today that will talk about healthcare in British Columbia and the kinds of things that we need to do to see individual, team, and systemic change happen. My guests today are John Schmid, who is a healthcare systems and leadership expert, Judy Duscher, who is the founder of Nursing the Future, and Victoria Schmid, who is the CEO of SwitchBC. Today, we have a vibrant conversation about the real issues that everyone that's working in healthcare at point of care through clinical leadership and management are facing. I know you're going to love today's show, so without further ado, let's get right into it. So, want to welcome you to the show, and I just feel really excited and honored to have all 3 of you here. And I want to start off with just learning a little bit about you. So, if each of you could share a little bit about your work, who you are, and what's got you really inspired right now. And we'll start with you, John.
Thanks very much, Trace. So my name is John Schmid. I'm a nurse, veteran, Canadian Forces, and current consultant and nonprofit leader. I've been in healthcare in Canada since 1995. My career started in the armed forces and then progressed into civilian emergency, flight nursing, ICU, and then into senior leadership over the course of 2 decades in 2 provinces. I've led clinical operations in 11 Canadian hospitals and currently consult internationally on the topic of patient safety and health technology assessment. So I'm passionate about the people that are currently doing the work. The people who are doing the work know what it's about. After nearly 2.5 decades of my own experience, I know what it's like to be a nurse. I know what it's like to care for people. It can be a taxing job. It's immensely rewarding. I wouldn't trade it anything that I've done in my career for a moment. And I'd like to shift into the kind of the last third of my career now, creating supports and solutions for the people that are picking up the torch and advancing our system.
Thank you for that, John. Such a wealth of experience that you've got there. As I'm listening to, how many Canadian hospitals have you been a part of?
11.
11, just 11. So you have a little bit of experience there. So thank you for that. Now we'll move to the next person. Judy, could you introduce yourself and your work and your passion?
Absolutely, Trace. And thanks so much for having me. I'm so grateful and honored to be amongst these scholars. I've been in this game for over 4 decades, and I've always been a passionate advocate for grassroots nursing practice. And I think that that's sort of my interest was inspired by my work at the bedside, how important that work is, how often under recognized and undervalued that direct care is. And having, filled the gamut of roles, coordinators, manager, direct care nurse, all different sorts of things in both the US and Canada, I think I've just become more committed to the challenges, but also the passion and commitment of the nurses that do their grassroots work. My research for the last 25 years, and certainly my current passion is working with newly graduated nurses. And it stemmed from the death of my father, actually, at the hands of the healthcare system. That was probably the most profound experience I've ever had. And I remember, after witnessing the fractures in the system that allowed him to slip through those very precarious cracks, I remember saying I would never enter a hospital again.
Hmm.
And being someone who was so committed to that process, that was saying a lot. And so when he ultimately died, I remember thinking, but if I do leave and walk away from the issues and the challenges, is that really the best use of my experience and my expertise and my knowledge? And the answer to me was a glaring no. And so since then, for the past 25 years, I've been committed to research that speaks to new graduate transition. And as John has suggested early on, it's about how new graduates and their supporters are themselves supported to work through the cultural issues that we have, the practice challenges that we have. So that is currently, and has been for a while, my commitment.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience and being here with us, Judy. Thank you for that. And now we'll pass over to the next panelist.
Great. Thanks so much for having me here today, Trace. And it's so great to hear John and Judy's stories. I don't have a nursing background, actually. I'm a dietitian by trade. I decided between nursing and going into nutrition because nursing had night shifts and being a dietitian didn't. So at that point in choosing, and I chose to be a dietitian. And since then, I moved, after working as a dietitian, I moved into leadership, and that's really for me where I found my passion. But I'm the CEO of SwitchBC, which stands for Safety, Wellbeing, Innovation, Training, and Collaboration in Healthcare. And the impetus for SwitchBC, we're a pretty new organization in the BC healthcare space, but the impetus for Switch was really around how do we take care of our healthcare workers? So really recognizing that there wasn't a shared provincial approach to really supporting the health, safety, and well-being of the people who work in the system. And so for me, my passion around taking care of the people who come in every day to do their best in our system really is what drove me to accept taking a role in this organization and really trying to look at what are the ways that we can change the system to support the individuals in it. Through my leadership career, most recently, I was involved in leading the pandemic response for Island Health on Vancouver Island. And I think one of the pieces that I saw through the pandemic, which has really lit a fire in me, was through the pandemic, we continued to ask individuals to bear the burden of the system. So we said to people, we need you to work 24/7. We need you to be available at all hours. We need you to pull out all the stops. And if you come to us and say you're tired, we're going to say to you, well, you should probably do some more yoga, invest more in a mindfulness practice, figure this out on your own, instead of saying, wow, there are some big system pieces here that have really impacted how we're treating individuals in the system. And so for me, that's really been my passion as I move forward, is to say, how do we really look at the way that our system has been created, the way that we continue to reinforce a system that continues to eat away at people's individual resilience. We need a system that actually comes, when you come to work, your resilience is supported by the system that you work in, so that you can go home and have the energy to be involved and support your family and your community and the people that you love outside of work. I know a lot of healthcare workers who have just enough energy to get through their day at work, and they go home exhausted. And I think that's a real travesty for our system. And I think that's why young nurses aren't staying in the workforce. I think the new generation coming into the workforce is saying, you guys, this is ridiculous. We're not putting up with this. And so I think, to what Judy and John talked about, if we really want people to invest their careers in healthcare and give up a good portion of their life to take care of other people, we're really going to have to look at how we set the system up differently to support them.
All right, now we're getting into it now, Victoria. Thank you for that. So, as I've shared with you before, off camera or off audio, this show is really committed to trying to create support and content that's going to help clinical leaders, managers, and staff to create a psychologically healthy and safe space. And so, from each of your perspectives, I'm curious, what have you learned about what ingredients we can bake into that cake that creates that safe space, especially as it relates to your experience with being on the floor, maybe in an educational or support position, and then also systemically too. So we'll go in the same order, John. What have you learned about the ingredients that need to be there to be able to create a safe space for people in healthcare?
It seems like a very straightforward question. I'm going to give you a less straightforward answer, I suspect here. So a little bit about my experience. Because it's important context for what I'm about to say. I started as an ER nurse, an ICU nurse, a flight nurse. I worked in the north in Saskatchewan Indigenous communities, fly-in basis, doing autonomous nursing practice. And then I transitioned into education. I was an educator. Like I said, I got into senior leadership, but I was also a faculty member at 3 different universities and taught acute care nursing to 4th-year students. So I've worked with emerging nurses, they're like nursing students. I've worked with nurses as peers, in the trenches, so to speak, mostly in acute care and high acuity practice environments. And I've worked as a leader, operations leader, being accountable for the safety of my staff and being accountable for the care and the defect that happens day to day, both with patients and with providers. So the ingredients I've seen that are necessary is joy in work. To me, that is the most important ingredient. You have to have joy in work. And in fact, the IHI cites that as a very as a critical component. And there's an entire literature, bodies of literature that research that. My own personal experience as post-pandemic, I definitely lost joy in work after 2 years of working 24/7, running 2 hospitals, collectively over 700 beds and 3,000 employees, all in burnout mode, right? And with heavy attrition. Even physicians were in my office crying during throughout the pandemic. And healthcare was in a precarious position before the pandemic. I think that's important to state. This has been a long time coming.
Right.
I've nursed in hallways since 1998.
Right.
As a nursing student, and I nursed 14-hour shifts, 16-hour shifts. When I was a transport nurse, I'd do 24-hour shifts. It wasn't frequent, but I certainly did that. Put myself at risk, put my patients at risk by doing that, because there was no solution for the patients. I either did that or I went home knowing that the patients were at risk or potentially died because there was nobody there to care for them. And that's been the last 2 years. So providers carry a huge amount of responsibility, and by nature, they're compassionate, empathetic people. And so when you are working in an environment that's under-resourced, that has a high level of defect, up to 30% harm rate, you see harm and defect. And Judy's story about her father resonates. I've certainly seen many people die due to preventable error in healthcare. I know what that does to the staff and physicians involved. And I know what that did to me, having to sit across tables from families to say, your son died preventably in our care, right? And other stories. On the other side of things, I've seen staff, I've had nurses that have been sexually assaulted at work, knocked unconscious, inhaled toxic substances, you name it. Think of a scenario, knives and guns, verbal assault, racism, These are all realities of the workplace, and I think it's important to talk about. I'm always strategic when I have these conversations with new providers, and even senior providers. It's difficult to balance how frankly we talk about these realities in healthcare, because going back to joy, how do you find joy in an environment that is can be so austere?
Right.
It's a balancing act, and oftentimes we're fiddling around the edges of quality and safety because resources just aren't there. So no matter how you're set up, you're in a pick your poison scenario every day. Nurses come to work and they're short-staffed, and they know that their ratios are unsafe. They know that something bad is probably going to happen to one of their patients during the shift, and they manage that stress. And then they have to be cognizant about their own safety. And to Victoria's point about yoga, asking providers and clinicians to invest in their self-care, it's important. As a veteran, I don't want to dismiss the importance of yoga and breathing and journaling and all these things. Mindfulness is very important, and we should all practice those things. So I don't want to dismiss that. However, the system will chew you up and spit you out if you don't have a strategy. And I used when I hired new emergent nurses after about the first year of being a manager and hiring new staff, and I was fairly junior in my career at that point. Been nursing for about 10 years and was now accountable for the nursing practice of hundreds of emergency nurses, some with experience, many with very little experience coming into that acute practice environment. I would say, what's your plan? Because after a year, I could see that every new hire I brought in to the department would quickly reduce hours or quit. And when I say they would either leave and go to a different specialty, or some would bartend or find other ways to make money. So yeah, I think going back to it though, like the key ingredient is definitely making people feel safe, and having them find joy in work.
As I'm listening to you, I'm just thinking back to Victoria's point, and I'm wondering if, like, the point that I heard and what Victoria was sharing was that, typically speaking, in our healthcare system, we kind of offload the responsibility for self-care and psychological protection to the individual. And yeah, of course, we all have an individual responsibility, but there's this missing piece of providing the kind of supports in the system and leadership support, and giving leaders the tools and skills that they need to be able to do what you're talking about. So it makes me curious, because of your leadership experience, what kinds of supports were there for you to provide that psychologically healthy and safe space, and maybe where were there some shortfalls or needs that we could have shored up, or maybe to Victoria's point, we're on the way to shoring up with a systemic approach rather than just an individual approach.
Yeah, short answer is zero. There were zero supports for me as a health leader. Yeah, I was an expert clinician at the time in my career where I transitioned to leadership, and as a junior leader, I had very little. I worked with. I don't want to throw shade on the people that I worked with and who did mentor me. I had excellent people in my life that were available to me as mentors, but from a systems perspective, I had zero supports. I was given $8 million and 200 people to manage, and no formal training, no onboarding. It was here's your office, here's your phone, good luck type scenario. When I progressed all the way up to chief operating officer of a large inpatient and outpatient hospice system, the supports were very limited. And of course, the higher you go, the lonelier it gets, so to speak, because of the level of accountability you assume. But quick story with one of the health regions I left, every single position I left in the recent health authority on Vancouver Island, I was replaced with two people.
Right.
Holding senior clinical operations roles as a director. And as I transitioned out of those positions, I was replaced with multiple people. So that's encouraging. And I want to point that out as a positive thing, because you're seeing the system respond to burnout and respond to the workloads that aren't solvable. And I know directors and managers, which are, when I say directors and managers, I'm referring to nurse leaders in particular.
Right.
They're working 80-hour weeks, and they're always on, and they can't not answer their phone. They can't not look at a text because somebody's life is on the other end of it. There's a decision that needs to be made to transport a patient, to accept a patient, to move a patient. And every single one of those decisions, they're directing clinicians from all walks of our system to assume risk. So I need you to take this. I need one more patient. I need you to hang this drug you've never done before because it's an off-service situation. I need you to work short. I'm sorry. I need you, and these are the types of situations. Like, everybody wants to be in charge until it's time to be in charge. It's kind of my joke, but I say it tongue in cheek because it's true. They're
Well, the stakes are pretty high that you're talking about, right? Like, it's one thing to be in that and learning that with a support system in place, but if you don't have support and you're on your own, you're talking about a very high stakes environment to try and navigate. So, yeah, I really appreciate what you're sharing, and also it gives me some hope listening too, because if there's a big leadership gap there, yeah, it's terrible that that's there, that it's still kind of trying to be filled, but it also means that there are probably some really powerful systemic things we can do to shore that up and change that. So thank you so much. Now, as you're listening to this, Judy,
if I could just say one more thing.
Yeah, for sure.
I think it's really important, and it just came into my head.
Yeah.
The one thing about health leaders, especially nurse leaders, is that the system strips you of your clinical identity as soon as you decide to step into leadership.
Right.
You can no longer practice nursing at the bedside. You can no longer stand next to your nurses on the unit and help them deliver care. Right? You can push a stretcher around, you can look visible, but
Right.
you're not allowed to practice nursing in the sense that you're delivering direct patient care to patients who need it. And that is a problem. Physicians can do both, right? They stay clinically competent and they can lead medical governance structures, but nurses aren't allowed that. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I think it's important to stay connected to the work, especially in clinical operations. As an executive, maybe not so much, but definitely at the manager and director levels in the Canadian system that we have, our leadership loses touch with the front line. They forget what it's like to assume the risk that our clinicians and nurses are assuming. And I think it's a big gap that needs to be addressed as well. So.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I'm thinking of conversations I've had with a colleague of mine that is for keeping their nursing up to date by picking up shifts outside of the current situation that they're in, because they're not in a practice role anymore. So, and that's exactly why, because she wants to stay fresh and also doesn't want to lose that clinical practice area that's so important to her as well. So thank you for bringing that up. Super important. So Judy, as you're listening to all of this, from your perspective, back to the question, what do you notice that we need to have as ingredients to create a safe space for people that are working in healthcare today?
Well, I guess to start with, I've had a very similar trajectory to John. Once I became a practicing nurse, I started with a diploma in nursing and pursued sort of that science evidence piece gradually over time. But that practice piece was very important to me. So when I was a manager, and John, I totally appreciate your comments about how hard it was for me to stay connected to my nurses in practice, which I felt was pivotal for me to understand the challenges that they were actually experiencing, not just theoretically. And so I did take patients. And I kind of had to in some ways because we were so short-staffed. And so I would take a pot of patients, and I'll tell you, that kept me connected to what was going on. I had a 41-bed telemetry unit. So these were, these nurses, they really needed constant advancement and support for their knowledge and support for their evolving practice. And I wasn't able to get that for them. I had no problem, the hospital had no problem funding physician support systems And no, I don't bemoan the physicians that at all. I'm thinking that was really awesome. But when you have a nurse practitioner or a clinical nurse specialist that is purely in a role of supporting the physician and not supporting the nurses and the patients in practice, something's kind of wrong with that ideology and that approach to the workplace. So I found it both difficult and empowering to forge my own way as a manager. But it didn't take me long to feel the pressure from my director and from other managers who had since become acclimatized and enculturated into this idea of, no, we don't practice, we just staff, and we deal with the management issues that we need to, without really knowing what is going on in practice with our employees. So after a while, I lost my oomph to do that, and definitely didn't have the support. So that all that to say, and my work with new graduates who are incredibly vulnerable when they come into practice. I mean, not only I took so many notes while you were talking, Trace and John. It's one thing to be alone in practice. It's another thing to not be alone but feel alone. And I think that newly graduated nurses, just developmentally, they're not as comfortable with expressing their concerns or their feelings of inadequacy or something that they might not have done that now they're expected to do in fear of not being accepted. And so that lasts for a while with newly graduated nurses. And when you think about what's so critically important to support them through that, first of all, people are always saying, yeah, we need to get rid of this transition experience. Well, no, we don't need to get rid of the transition experience. We need to support the nurses who are going through a transition to a more advanced level of practice, student to practitioner, bedside nurse to educator to manager. These are all transition experiences that need to be supported by people who've been there, people who are experts, and people who have somehow found a way to balance this idea of what the healthcare system actually is relative to what we want it to be. And we always need to be moving forward, but the new graduate is almost on a mouse on a wheel, just trying to keep up with everything that's going on around them. And if they don't have the support, it's honestly from a patient safety perspective, there's lots of evidence to suggest that that's a very unsafe practice to put new graduates, for instance, in an emergency room where you require the capacity to deal with instability, unpredictability, inconsistency, and a lack of familiarity. All of those pieces are essential to new graduate practice and to kind of get their confidence level up and their practice expertise evolving. So support, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that the mentorship, and John alluded to this as well, is something that we have not really wrapped our heads around. And now we're in a real pickle because we don't have the really expert practitioners out there to mentor these newly graduated nurses when they come in. And I don't want to belabor this, but I do want to say that I have tremendous concerns about the evolution of practice knowledge, and I mean tacit knowledge, because we don't have those individuals coming into or staying in practice right now. So how do we provide them with these patterns of recognition when we're gone? And they're developing very immature patterns of recognition, and they're carrying those on because there's no one to push them forward in that. So I just kind of thinking about the safety systems, and just going back to one more comment about what you were saying, John. This idea of not in of having to work or having to get nurses to support the practitioners that are there because we're so short-staffed. And I ended up working as a manager because we were so short-staffed. But I discouraged my staff from, like, when I would leave at the end of the day, they'd often be asked to work overtime and double shifts and whatnot. And I actually discouraged them from doing that on my own unit. I said, if you continue to do that, there is no way we can be held responsible and accountable and get the resources to you that you need not to do that. So we had a really great safety system in Saskatchewan. I've never seen anything like it before or since. And it was a system whereby you would pick up the phone, dial 311 or whatever, and you would speak directly to a person. You wouldn't be told to go online and spend an hour and a half, which of course you don't have, to fill out a safety form that that you simply don't do, and therefore it's not recorded. That was a line I encouraged my staff to phone if they were short-staffed or they had concerns with practice issues, couldn't get a hold of a physician, whatever. Because those came to me as a manager, and they were like fodder for my own movement that I was trying to engage in, and that was to support the nurses when something went wrong. So I don't think we have even the potential to report these kinds of challenges in a way that makes sense and is feasible for these practitioners that are up to their eyeballs in chaos. So those are a few things I know that will circle back around, and I'll have an opportunity to offer more. It feels like a dissertation defense. But
well, there's a lot of, you just shared a lot, and it makes me so curious to ask some more questions, but I want to get Victoria's response, because some of the things that you were saying and we've talked about so far we're kind of leaning into systemic ideas. And so I'm curious, Victoria, from your perspective and also from the perspective of SwitchBC as well, what are you noticing that we need to have as ingredients for the system and for folks that have committed their lives to be in healthcare? What do we do to create a safe space for them to be able to practice and lead in our system in British Columbia?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that, Trace. And Judy, I just have to say, that safety alert system was my life work in Saskatchewan. And I led the charge in implementing that provincially. And so to hear you talk about that in such a good way just brings so much joy to me, particularly when it is really hard to lead system change. And so to hear of the impact that that's had just is a huge bright point for me today. So thank you.
Wow.
And so, Trace, I'm going to start with a story that actually feeds into the safety alert system and why I led that work in Saskatchewan. But the work started for me as a new dietitian. So to bring it back to where we talk about new professionals coming into the workforce. And I started out working, at that time I was working in a BC health authority. And I started out as a new dietitian working in the emergency department, in the ICU, and on medicine and surgery. And we had a patient that came into the ICU one day, and he was part of the underhoused population, and he was severely malnourished, and he came in unconscious by ambulance. And the physician chose to start feeding him with TPN, which is total parenteral nutrition, which is where they put the nutrition right into your veins. And I just remember learning in school, of course, because I was still so new, that there's a lot of risks when you have people who are malnourished and you feed them too much. In fact, you can actually kill people in that way. And so the physician had written the orders for the feed rate, which was very high for this malnourished individual. And so as a dietitian, of course, because I can't write orders in the chart, I can only write recommendations. So underneath the physician's orders, I wrote dietitian recommends, and I wrote out why we should not be feeding at such a high rate, and I put in a new rate. I came in the next morning excited because I thought, okay, we're going to have decreased the feed. I'm going to see how Carl's doing, see if maybe he's conscious now. And when I looked in the chart, my charting had actually been scribbled out by the physician, and they had rewritten their orders underneath. And this went on for multiple days. And then I raised my concerns to the nurse manager. I raised my concern to a couple of other physicians who worked in the ICU. I went as far up the chain of command as I could, and no one wanted to tell that physician that he was providing the wrong care for this patient. And Carl died. We killed Carl. And what I will say about that experience is I worked as a dietitian for 11 months and 6 days. And that is because I could not work any longer as a frontline provider where I had no voice, where I could see what was happening, where I could see the risks, and no one would listen to me. And so I moved into leadership after that because I thought, if I can't exist in a system where I have voice and I can impact what I know needs to be the right thing to happen, then I need to move into leadership and change the system. And so that for me has really been what's led my career in leadership and why I'm so passionate about psychological safety. Because if we don't give the people who are in the midst of providing care and services in our health system the voice to raise the flag and say, there is a risk here, there is a problem here, we see what's going to unravel, and you need to listen to us. If we don't give people voice to raise those concerns, if we don't give people voice into creating the solutions that they know are the right solutions for their problems, we're never going to get out of the mess that we're in right now. I know a ton of really smart executives, but let me tell you, I don't care how smart you are, 12 executives sitting around a board table can never create the right solution for the problems that our point of care providers and service providers know are the right things for us to do. And so for me, it's really that ability to raise your voice, to impact the solutions that are happening, and really to make mistakes and to feel like someone's going to have your back if you make a mistake. Those are the things we need to pull around the new people coming into our system, because otherwise, you're going to come in for a blink of an eye and you're going to take one look around and you're going to say, this health system that was created in the 1950s, it doesn't fit who I am as a Gen X, as a millennial, as a Gen Y, like whoever I am coming into the system, it's not working for me and I'm going to leave. And so for me, the work that I want to do is the work to support our system to be able to do those three things: hear people's voice, bring voice into the solutions that we're creating, and really wrap around people when they make mistakes and learn from those.
Thank you so much for sharing that story and that perspective, Victoria. As I'm listening to everybody sharing about what they're noticing from each perspective, one thing that keeps coming up for me as a theme is this idea that we need to have the kind of relational equity built with one another at all levels in the healthcare system so that we can navigate some of these incredibly difficult, complex problems. Like, there's just no way we can even attempt to solve any of these without having the kind of relational trust and connection to be able to look outside of the box and maybe even throw the box away and find something new. And so as I think about the people that I've come across that are in this big transition from sort of old world command and control styles of leadership and hierarchical structures that have their place within our system, and that we do need to have hierarchy in different parts of our leadership system in healthcare, in my opinion. But when it comes to working with people, those command and control approaches really start to break down. And so there's this transition that's going on to something more relational, something that is more in a shared leadership structure. And for leaders that are making this transition, that's in some cases, a terrifying transition, like to go from, being in control of everything, getting tasks done, and then realizing that nothing I do works, to then letting go of all of that and into a different skill set. That can be really scary for leaders and managers. And so I'm curious, what's an encouraging word that you could give to that manager or that leader that's trying to make that transition and build the kind of relational equity we need? What's one thing that you could share with them from each of your perspectives that might encourage or inspire them to be able to do that?
Maybe I can jump on that question, Trace. sounds a little cliche, but I think that leaders have to remember that they work for their teams, right? Their teams don't work for them. It's a very important concept. It's been, servant leadership should be baked into everything in healthcare because we all serve our patients. And in order to serve our patients, our providers need to be supported. And so that was always my ethos and what I shared to my staff. But again, easy to say, difficult to implement. I think it's important to remind junior and senior leaders that we can't boil the ocean. You hear that adage quite often, and it's true. If you try and take a 10,000 foot approach to a issue on a medical surgical unit that is relevant and important to patient in bed 6 and the nurse looking after them, you're going to fail, right? We need to take have a balanced approach that involves listening to patients and families, and the providers at the bedside. When I say bedside, it can be anywhere. It can be the community. It can be, long-term care, primary care, all the practice environments that we have and resource. But I think that's it. It's taking time to breathe and have conversations with people. Like, it's visible leadership. You have to be present. So at the very top, we have to provide, resources for our leaders. They have to have the right administrative support so that they're not stuck in their office doing administrative tasks that somebody else could do, so that they can be visible in their practice areas, their areas that they're responsible for, talking to their teams, their allied health teams, and also talking to the patients and families that they're serving. Without doing that, you miss a lot of context and perspective. And then I'll balance that statement by saying you also need a strategy, because if you start to do that, it can be quick. It's overwhelming because the amount of defect and resource scarcity that you're served with, like, any other business in any other sector would just scale services. Like, you would just scale services. But we don't have that. We don't have that luxury. So, I used to run a 500 bed hospital. I had funds and budget for 500 beds and a baseline staff that was under baseline to serve those beds, but it always ran at 550. So I always had 50 patients that weren't budgeted, weren't funded, weren't staffed for. They were in hallways. They were in sunrooms. They were in closets. It was all unsafe, right? And so bad things would happen. And I found myself always talking to families after something terrible had happened, right? Bad experience, defect causing injury, life-changing injury, or even death. And or a staff member that had been critically injured due to violence or some sort of workplace safety event. And that, as a leader, was very emotionally taxing on me. So I was always there. I was the guy that couldn't go home and eat dinner. Emotionally, I was tied to the mission and my purpose as a leader. And when there's not enough resources to accomplish the mission, you just stay and you just work, right? And so that's a trap that a lot of leaders fall into, especially junior leaders. They just don't go home. They just stay there. And that's not sustainable. And your shelf life is very short when you do that. And it impacts your family life. It impacts your personal life, your physical health, your mental health. And ultimately, that's why people leave. So I think the advice I give to junior leaders is pace yourself. As a leader, you're actually accountable for yourself. No one else is coming. Like, no one is coming to help you, so to speak. There is supports out there, but you have to seek them out. You're accountable for putting your own oxygen mask on first, and you need to lead by example to your staff, and just be kind, be compassionate, be vulnerable. I learned way too late in my career that it's okay to be vulnerable with your team. So you don't have the right answers, or you don't have all the answers. It's okay to be emotional in front of the people that you're leading, and it's okay to say sorry and to acknowledge when you were wrong.
Yeah, I think it's also okay to invite your boss into that and ask for help as well. And I think one of the things that I see that's really glaringly missing a lot of the time is that the gaps between leaders are also vast. Like there's just not enough sort of connection between the structure of leadership in healthcare organizations that could help to support what you're talking about, John. So powerful what you're sharing. Thank you very much. So Judy, what about you? When you think of speaking to the leaders or managers, clinical or otherwise, what is something that you could say to them that you think, yeah, this is something I could give you as advice that would help you to build relationship with your people?
Oh, well, I guess first I have to go back to what Victoria was speaking about, because Carl was my father, Victor Michael Boychuk. And when I felt your heart in your eyes and your voice, I'm just trying to contain myself, um, because people were not listening. That is just so critical. And so if I'm to advise anyone on anything, it's like listen and actually hear what that individual is saying, whether it's a direct care nurse or a unit manager. When I think about the times I tried to channel my managerial approach to what my staff needed, I was never supported to do that. And I knew that I needed to come in at 5:30 because my staff on nights needed support and they needed direction. So I did that for a while, but I was expected to stay until 5. So I was not supported to actually manage my staff the way I knew I needed to. When I think about, and it's so interesting, Victoria, boy, it's just like a blueprint for what happened to my father when you were talking, because it was a dietitian that was trying so hard to ensure that the physician understood the nutritional challenges that my dad was facing, and how to navigate those when you give someone who just had uh, a colectomy, total colectomy because of bowel cancer. You sent him a steak for dinner. uh it's like you realize, even as a non-knowledgeable family member, my mother said, "Should he be eating this?" And I'm like, "Of course not." So then I try to approach the physician, and just this hierarchical piece. Like, I totally get what you're saying, Trace. We need hierarchy because it provides us with structure and order. I get that. But when it starts to interfere with the blurring between roles, which is what we should have some overlap and some blurring so that people are talking to one another and not feeling like I gotta stay in my little lane here, or I'm going to get in trouble. That's when we get into trouble, is when we
Mhm.
start listening to the people that are in another lane but have observed something that I'm doing, and invite me to grow and change. So I just think about how important it is to have everyone at the table when you're having these discussions, and to structure the system so that you kind of force people to be a part of the conversation. And that's what SAS did, Victoria,
Mhm.
is every time one of the nurses put in a report through the safety system, I got it and I had to respond within 24 hours. So the structure was supporting me as a manager because I wanted to respond, I wanted to make a change, but unless the system said, you have to do this, I wouldn't have been able to have the power that I had once those reports were submitted. And I still remember this one situation where a a patient had been transferred. It was an off service situation because I had a cardiology unit. So this patient was a long-term chronically ill patient, and came to us with bed sores and wounds that needed to be taken care of. And at one point, a nurse approached me and said, "I'm really concerned about this wound." So she came to my office. I went to the patient room, looked at this wound. It was unbelievable what I saw. And I knew that we were not treating this patient the way we needed to. They weren't escalating the care. We tried to escalate it, but it was met with, we'll get there when we can get there. So I initiated a high level safety response. And the actual vice president of, because I escalated it to a particular point, the vice president of the hospital had to come up to my unit and listen to us and look at the patient, and then they had to write a report. So people were accountable, and that saved that patient's life, that system. And I made it very clear to patients and families, you can phone this number. And I made it a point of the nurses making sure they informed the patients and families, this is the number you call if when you've approached me and I'm not doing what you feel I ought to be doing, you have a way to express that. So I think accountability, listening, and then being held accountable for what you heard. I'm going to sort of leave it there for now because I'm sure Victoria has so much to offer.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. That was an amazing example and just sort of framework, Judy. Thank you for that. Victoria, what about you as you listen to this? What's the advice or suggestion you could make to leaders?
Yeah, I think Judy already nailed it. How do we really listen, right? So I watch a cartoon called Bluey with my 7-year-old daughter, and it's a cartoon about dogs, and Bluey's a little blue heeler. And in one episode, she keeps just talking over her little sister who's trying to tell her something, and the mom says, "Bluey, find your ears." And that was actually what we went into training our executives with when we did the executive training for the safety alert system. So the training that we provided for executives was we actually took them to an offsite place where we ran them through simulation training. We hired actors from the local university who came in and acted out being in different clinical or different high conflict situations. And then we sent executives in to deal with that situation. We actually videoed it. When they came back to the room, we watched the video and then we unpacked the response. And what we said to executives was, when you respond to a safety alert, your first job is to listen. Your first job is to listen, because you don't have to have the answers, because that's what executives kept saying. They're like, we don't know what to do. And I said, yeah, exactly. So go back to Einstein's comment, which is, I have no particular talent. I'm only passionately curious. Listen with your ears, be curious. The team that's there, they know what to do. You don't have to know what to do. You need to create the space for them to bring that solution forward. And so for me, I think that's where we really need to help our leaders is this isn't about ego. You get to be an executive because your job, like John said, is to serve your team, is to serve your organization, is to serve the people who come in every day to do their best job. It's not because you have all the answers. You never will have all the right answers. Your job is to support your people, to listen to the solutions that they're bringing forward. There's some great research out of Harvard right now that's talking about how emotional validation and listening is actually one of the biggest keys to building trust in the workplace. And so when we take the time to actually validate what people are saying to us, to say, wow, yeah, you're right. This is really, really difficult. You're right. This is really hard. I don't have the answers, but let's work together through this. I'm listening. That's, to me, where I want all of our leaders to be, because I think that if we do that, and to your point, in the hierarchy, if we're all doing that with the people who report to us, and we have the ability to do that to the people we report to, we can actually move that voice up the line to the people who have the resources to be able to support real change for the people who provide care and services in our system.
Wow. Curiosity is a superpower. Thank you for that, Victoria. So bringing things to a close now. Sorry, go ahead.
Do you mind if I just inject a bit of
for sure. Yeah, jump in.
a quick story? So I'm just listening to Judy and Victoria talk about voice and accountability and escalation. And I'm reminded of a couple incidents as a leader when I was trying to promote patient-centric policy and policy. So, one is as a senior leader in a hospice, I had a patient who was dying, actively dying, and really, really wanted his two little dogs with him. And we had a policy against dogs in certain circumstances. And I'm like, okay, art of the possible, patient-centered, this man's dying wish is to have his dogs with him. How can we accommodate this? What can we do instead of what can't we do, right? And I had this big facilitated conversation with the staff who were very resistant. I wasn't listening to them. And they reluctantly said, okay, fine, let the dogs in. We put a plan together and the team got behind it. Everybody was involved in the discussion, but there was hierarchy. And I definitely leveraged that hierarchy in hindsight, right? Like I didn't listen. Dogs bit the nurse, right? So it sounds a little humorous. They were little dogs. She wasn't tragically injured or anything, but she was injured at work. And I had to eat a lot of humble pie there and go back and apologize. Yeah, I didn't listen. Like you'd seen the dogs before. You had a suspicion. You were scared of dogs to begin with, right? Like, and here I was trying to stay focused on the patient and not listening. And, other times when we had major safety issues in an emergency department where there was a shooting and nurses held at knife point and threatened with knives. It culminated in a Sentinel event. And so we had a major safety debriefing where there was tears, lots of crisis counseling required, evidence of post-traumatic stress coming out within the staff. And the staff all said, like, I said, what do you need? As the leader in the room, facilitating the conversation and the debriefing, what do you need? They all said resolutely, we need weapons out of the department. We don't feel safe, right? So I went to the senior leadership team and I said, we need to figure out how to eliminate weapons coming into the department because they're a hazard and they're hurting our people, and our people are leaving because of it, and their careers and their lives are being impacted terribly. And the team, like the senior leadership team, said, oh, well, we can't do that. All the things that the nurses, I won't go into every detail, but everything that the nurses suggested as a solution to eliminating that threat in their workplace, the executive team, for various reasons, some were political, some were financial, others, they all had reasons why it wouldn't work. And they said, so then as the operations director, I had to go back to my manager and to the physicians and say, we're not doing anything that you just suggested. And that is a gutting feeling as a leader. It leaves you very hollow. So I just wanted to kind of give that, we're talking about voice from a clinical perspective and how it impacts clinicians and their work experience. But as a leader, when you don't have a voice and you have to go back to those people, it's a terrible feeling that results in attrition and results in apathy, which leads to defect causing harm for both our staff and our providers.
These are calm. Yeah, go ahead.
Follow up just quickly on that because
yeah, for sure.
He nails it. It's important to listen. It's as important to hear and then act on what you heard. And I think John's point about having to go back, like every time for the last 2 years, I retired from teaching in July, but the last 2 years had been so difficult for me walking into my final year student classrooms, and they would ask me, what's happening? What's going to be done about it? What's the future look like? And my experience of being shut down so many times and watching staff nurses and managers shut down after they had identified really creative solutions to things, but because they were challenging to fix, they were shut down. I didn't know what to say. And when you don't know any longer what to say to your students or to your staff, that's a very eroding experience for any manager. And that's where that burnout is coming. So this idea of, I just want to talk about servant leadership for a second, because I am an absolute believer in servant leadership. And thank you, John, for starting us out with that. Maybe we end with that. We are all servants. We are all servants. And so when you think about who am I serving as a manager, I was serving my staff. Because if I didn't serve my staff can't serve the patients and families or communities or whatever it is. I had one experience where I was, and I spent many, many years when I was in nursing education as an acute care clinical practitioner, a clinical educator like you, John. And I remember I had one just a beautiful young student, and she was in working with a patient, and she was basically forced in this situation to do something to that patient that she felt was really unethical. And I didn't know that that was going on until it was pretty much done. And I walk into the room and I'm experiencing that with her. She was so distraught. I had to get her counseling after that experience. And what I decided to do was I knew the VP personally. And I really believed that the VP needed to hear this story and needed to understand what was going on that particular unit. The VP met with us within an hour because that student was so distraught. And the student had closure. The VP instituted some protocols, took time, but instituted certain protocols alongside the manager that would ensure that that situation never happened again. But it was the availability of that individual. And one more story, I don't want to end on the negative, but as much as I respected the director that I worked under as a manager, that director was completely disconnected from what was actually happening in the practice area. I was connected as a manager, as most managers are, if you don't make their portfolio so big they can't be connected to their units. But when I would go to the director and say, this is something that I need on my unit, I didn't get the support for that. And so as a manager, eventually over time, and this is what I noticed when I would meet with the other managers, is they had just acclimatized to this. Yeah, no sense in suggesting it because it's never going to happen. Right. And they then became completely disempowered. And I was just stunned. Here are these incredible leaders who feel so powerless that they've become numb. So I think if that director understood, her job was to serve me. My job was to serve my staff. My staff's job is to serve the patients, communities, and families. I think that if everybody does their job, we have a functional system.
You're kind of making my point that I was making earlier for me, Judy. And one of the things that I notice with executive leaders, directors, and up is that oftentimes they can talk about the problems, but they don't actually feel on a human level what those problems are. And so for the manager who's looking at that director or ED or whatever and saying, I need help with this, they really need to actually invite that person down into what's going on so that they can feel it and it's visceral rather than just something that's on an email or on a list of things to do. And I find that gap, if you can include that human being into what's going on, it can start to shift and change things. To your point, John, what you were talking about around violence, obviously this has been a suggestion that I know has come up in health authorities for quite a while over the last few years, actually. And so there's different reasons why we can't do stuff. That said, though, wouldn't that conversation have been easier, or if the ED came and had it with you or with us rather than by yourself? Because we can't do everything that everybody suggests. That's not going to be possible or plausible. That at the same time, we got to be able to tell the truth and be vulnerable about what it is that we're navigating as leaders in that situation. Like, I don't know what the answer here is. That's not the answer. I feel terrible that it's not the answer, but it's not. And so now we need to find a way to navigate forward. And so let's go, let's do that. And not having the answer oftentimes seems to be such an uncomfortable place, or having the unpopular answer, or the one that, isn't really looked on it with, isn't wanted. So I think about all of that and I go, yeah, that is back to relationship again, and having the kind of relationships with people so that we flatten that hierarchy in that regard. Because I think that at that point, we can all be even shoulder to shoulder, serving one another and the patients at the end of the day, right? So that said, let's bring things to a close. I would love to hear from each of you, how can people get in touch with you, and what is it that you're working on that you'd love to share with them right now? And we'll go in the same order with John starting.
That's great. Thanks, Trace. People can get in touch with me via email at John, Jon, at roll4, ROLE, the number 4.biz, B-I-Z, or go to my website, roll4.biz. I'm passionate about advocacy, patient safety, operation support, mentoring leaders, mentoring nurses. I'm actually in the process of reentering clinical practice, which is very exciting. It's also a process that's been quite humbling, because I let my license go back in 2017 because I thought those horses had left the barn for good. But so now I'm going back to basics within the system and trying to claw my way back in to get a license and be able to learn and practice again. So that's the way. Reach out. I'm happy to collaborate and have discussions with anyone who wants to help improve and support the people doing our important healthcare.
Thanks, John. Judy.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Trace. I think my passion for the transition experience of newly graduated nurses into this dynamic and very tumultuous and challenging, but so potentially rewarding environment has resulted in my being part of a nonprofit organization. It's currently being funded by the Canadian Nurses Foundation. It's called Nursing the Future. And in fact, all four of us will be engaging in further discussion about culture and the context of nursing practice that can support not only new graduates, but the seasoned practitioners that they work with. So you can just go to nursingthefuture.ca on the website and go to contact, and you'll be able to connect with me. And again, thank you so much, Victoria and John, for the privilege of spending this time with all three of you. I'm so grateful.
Victoria.
Yeah, and I think for me, I'll talk about what I'm doing personally, and then I'll talk a little bit about the work we're doing at Switch. But I think personally, I think one of the things that I've really experienced both in my life and as we've gone through the pandemic is the learning around when we experience trauma. It's not so much the traumatic incident that impacts us. It's the feeling of having to deal with it alone, or the lack of supports afterwards, that actually creates the trauma for us. And so one of the pieces that I've been doing is really reaching out to a lot of different leaders and really creating relationships across this space where we support each other through the difficult things. So for example, I have numerous colleagues that I call friends that I will often just text them and say, hey, do you have 15 minutes? And we will get on the phone and cry through a conversation. They'll just listen to me as I talk about how frustrated I am or what's not working. And I think that for me has been a lifeline. And, I talked to one of those colleagues at a conference I was at on Thursday, Dr. Lawrence Yang, who is an amazing primary care physician here in BC. And he is kind of doing the same thing, where he's just this amazing support to so many of us who work in the system. So I just want to put a plug in for that, because I think that, like John said, it's lonely leading in this system. It's even lonelier when you don't have a collection of people who share your same passion and belief in leading in a different way. And so I just really want to make sure that for all of our leaders out there, if you don't have a community that you connect in, get a hold of me. I would love to chat with you. I would love to connect you in with all the leaders I know that are out there that really want to support new and young leaders in this space. At SwitchBC, we are working on 4 major projects right now. One is around psychological health and safety. So really looking at how do we change the system to support workers to have voice and to feel supported and have good mental health in this space. Another one is around violence prevention. So this year we'll be leading a big push to create a violence prevention strategy for the province. So really bringing in the voice of all of our partners in the space, really listening. We spent this year listening to frontline workers and care providers tell us about what they need in this space for violence prevention. And so we'll be pulling that together into recommendations for the Ministry of Health. We're also working on health and safety supports for physicians who work in the community that don't have the supports from their health authorities, but really to say, what do you need working in the community and how do we support you in your health and safety journey so that you can support your teams as well. And then we're also doing a big project that we'll be launching in June, which is safety infrastructure supports for the Joint Occupational Health and Safety Committees that do all of the staff safety at the team level across the whole health sector. So this is a way to really create safety infrastructure supports for them so that their jobs are easier, so we can start to collect data. I shouldn't say it out loud, but it's actually my dream that it's the foundation for a safety alert system for BC, because that's really where I want to take us. But that is, those are some of the pieces that we're working on at SwitchBC. My email is victoria.schmid@switchbc.ca. Just Google SwitchBC. We're on there, and send us an email. We'd love to hear from you.
Amazing, amazing work. Thank you. And we'll put links in the show notes for everybody so you can connect with each of these 3 folks there. And just want to close by saying thank you so much for the work that you're doing in the world and for being on the show.
Well, thanks, Trace, for the opportunity to be here and for creating the platform to share our voice. It's an honor, and I think it's important for people to have the opportunity to hear these types of stories, because healthcare is a complex system, and until you've worked in it, you don't really appreciate the nuances and the realities that our frontline workers and healthcare providers work in. So thank you as well.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you so much for reaching the end of our episode. And by all means, reach out to the guests through the show note links that I've placed there for you and just tell them what today's show meant to you. I know that they're going to love that. So you can reach out to them through those links or through LinkedIn. And if you are a leader, a clinical leader, a manager, or an executive in healthcare, and you'd like to discover what your healthcare leadership superpower is, I've created a free resource that you can click on as well. It's a very fun and quick quiz that you can take that might be serving to you to find out what are the different leadership superpowers that you've got hidden in the blind spots of your leadership and management. Go ahead and click on that and download it and let me know how that is for you as well. Again, thank you so much for listening to the end, and I'll look forward to being with you next time. Until then, remember to be a safe space. Thank you again for getting to the end of this podcast. And if you enjoyed this and you found that there was value in it for you, my invitation is for you to subscribe for future episodes that come out weekly on Tuesdays. Thank you again, and I'm looking forward to being with you next time. Now remember to be a safe space.